Good evening, everyone, and a special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. And it's great to have you with us. Tonight, we will continue with our study of the history of the church. We have taken up 650 years of the life of the church. Would you believe that? And we did that in 2 sessions so far. The first 300 years, we learned that the church was very much under persecution. It was in hiding. And then after that, it was liberated by, so to speak, by King or Emperor Constantine. And for the next 350 years, the world was pretty much Christianized until the barbarians took over the Roman Empire. They invaded the Roman Empire in the west, and then in the east, Islam started as and in the barbarians were practically they practically conquered the whole of the Roman Empire in the west, but with God's hand, we all learned that they finally converted most of them to Christianity. Not so in the East. In the East, Islam were the ones converting the Christians by force. We all learned that. That's why the eastern part of the world was pretty much more Islam than Christian. So that's how the world was divided. The West being ruled by the barbarians that converted to Christianity, and the East being ruled by Islam, all right? And that includes the birthplace of the church, which is Jerusalem, as we know. And we will take up how we tried to recapture Jerusalem when we talk about the Crusades. Well, we learned that among the barbarians, their King Clovis married a Christian. That's why he was converted into Christianity. And then it was taken over. He was succeeded by King Attila. And he was so impressed with the Christian world and the Pope that he made the Pope the de facto ruler of central Italy. So that is where we are going to start tonight. We are going to focus more on the West, where the barbarians that invaded them have practically converted to Christianity. As we also learned last time that the barbarians were called the Franks or Francia, which is the largest barbarian empire in the West, in Western Europe, consisting now of what we call France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany. They were the barbarian empire before. So tonight, we are going to take up 500 more years. So we're accelerating. We started out with the first 300 years, then 350 years. Now we're accelerating to 500 years. And so far, we were able to do that on time, right? Okay, so this is the subject for this evening. We have Christendom, Dark Ages of the Church, the Great Schism, and the Crusades. First, the birth of Christendom. After King Attila made the Pope the de facto ruler, succeeding kings were very much united with Christianity. Now we have Charles Martel, a Frank prince, and he was crowned king of the Franks by a bishop sometime in 732 AD. Charles Martel is the father of feudalism. You know, the feudalistic system, they would give, they practically gave a big part of his kingdom to the Pope, and he created what we call the Papal States That is the feudalistic system. The Pope was the one in charge of all this papal state. And then sometime in 751 AD, Pippin the Short, who is the son of Charles Martel, was also crowned king of the Franks, also by a bishop. So you can see that they are really beholden to the bishops of the church. In return, the king created the papal states and allowed acquisition of vast properties of Italy. So the church actually owned vast properties in Italy. But the papacy developed its dependence on, of course, the rulers, now under Pippin the Short. The next episode is really very interesting because this is really what we consider as the birth of Christendom. In 800 AD, Charlemagne, I think most of us who are reading history are familiar with Charlemagne or Charles the Great. He was crowned this time as the emperor, not just by a bishop. Right there, he was crowned emperor by the Pope as the new emperor of the Roman Empire. This is Charlemagne. So this is really, truly the birth of Christendom, the height of Christendom, so to speak. Charlemagne actually conducted the affair where he practically united the church with the affairs of the state. But this is kind of a reverse situation with that of Constantine. If we review our history during the time of Constantine, Constantine as an emperor as a Roman emperor was very much in charge of both the civil and religious affairs. This time is the reverse situation. It's pretty much the church that is in charge of both civil and religious affairs, except that the church is completely dependent on the emperor for military assistance. So we have what we call. All right, good evening, everyone, once again. Sorry for the glitch. I think we were already at the birth of Christendom. If we can move to the next slide, just a little review. We learned that Charles Martel was crowned king by a bishop, and then Pippin the Short crowned king also by a bishop, and in turn he created the papal states. That's why Christendom consisted of so many, the vast property of a vast portion of Italy, but they were still dependent on the Western rulers. If we can move to the next slide, we will learn that the Roman Empire was actually taken over by the church during the time of Charlemagne, sometime in 800 AD. Charlemagne is Charles the Great. He was crowned as the first two rulers were crowned emperor by the bishops, but this one, Charlemagne, was crowned emperor by the Pope. So, as I was explaining a while ago, this is actually a reverse of the Constantine situation. During the time of Constantine, it was practically Emperor Constantine that was governing the affairs of the church as well as the states. Here, the reverse is true because actually it's the Pope that was conducting the affairs of both the government and the church. However, the Pope was also dependent to the civil rulers, especially for military purposes to defend itself. So if we go to the next slide here, we have the union of the church and state. Oh, here we are, union of church and state. This is the state of thing at that time. So the emperor, that's Charlemagne, acknowledged that his authority over his subjects came to him from God through the church. So he was very much fascinated by the Pope's authority. The Pope gave the emperor, however, the authority over the city of Rome and the papal states also. So this is now a uh, a union, a conglomeration of the affairs of the government and the Pope. But most of the time, it's the Pope that is making a call. But the emperor, of course, has a great influence on the affairs of both the seat of the church and state. The Pope, therefore, became the most powerful figure in all of Europe, although entirely dependent on the emperor from a political and military point of view. So that's the union of church and state. So Christianity was very powerful, was very widespread all over the West. Okay. And then now, of course, after that, the Charlemagne's reign ended by people who succeeded him. So if we go to the next slide, here we enter the dark ages of the church. This started with the fall of Charlemagne, and the successors actually utilized the church to perpetuate itself over the people. They ruled, and the church was this time really secularized because they started appointing lay people to hold positions in the church. If we go to the next slide, these are the enumeration of what consisted the dark ages of the church. Lay control of the church wealth and powers. So the emperor was the one controlling now all the power and wealth of the state. So they were the emperor was the one practically appointing the bishops and even the Pope. So it's just the other way around again. Another earmark of the Dark Age is the next slide we call simony, the buying of spiritual offices and favors. So lay people who have money would be able to get hold of the offices of the bishops, priests, and the clergy, so to speak, if they have the money to buy the office. It's it's a very corrupt practice. You know, the word simony was derived from Simon. In the book of Acts, as you know, there was this magician who was so impressed by the power of Peter because he saw Peter was able to through him, a lot of people got healed, and he said, I wanted to buy that kind of power. That's how the word simony started. All right. And then another one that contributed to the corruption of the church is the marriage of the clergy. This is the lifting of the discipline of celibacy. Of course, during the first 300 to 400 years, the clergy people that they recognize as their fathers of the church were married. Even the apostles were married. And then in the Council of Elvira, sometime in the 4th century, the church realized that it would not be good to have all the priests and the clergy people to be married, because there was a real conflict of interest. You know, when you're married, you have your family. Chances are your interest is to give priority to the to your family. So there was a conflict of interest. So they imposed the discipline of celibacy. Remember, celibacy is just a discipline. It's not a teaching of faith and morals. That discipline can change, and that was a discipline until the Dark Ages. They said, okay, we're gonna lift it up again. Now we have all married people who qualified to hold offices in the church. The marriage of the clergy, that contributed very much to the corruption of the church because of the conflict of interest between a married clergy his interest is swaying from the interest of the congregation to the interest of that of the church or the congregation or and the family. And then we have another source of the dark age, which is this one is really grievous because they had that practice of lay investiture. They don't care about who they ordain as priests or as clergy. So a lot of secular people came into the church. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that consequently, the civil rulers allowed, where civil rulers entered the church and they were allowed to govern in spiritual affairs. Now, I know that this is so devastating to the life of the church, but no matter what, Christ promised that he will be with us till the end of the age, that he will never leave us and forsake us. And indeed, he was true to that promise, because at the same time, there were some really saintly people that never gave up despite all these horrible things happening in the state of the church. They were praying so hard, and so they were the ones responsible for the renewal of the church in the 10th and the 11th century. So we move on to the next slide here. We have, but before that, yeah, of course, during the time when the civil rulers were conducting the affairs of the church, that's the time that we had this, what we call the bad popes. That is to be expected, because they were even the pope that held the papacy were very secular, and they were really corrupt. I think we've identified about 3 of them, like Pope John the 12th. I think he was appointed pope by the emperor when he was only 18 years old. Benedict the Ninth, and even Pope Benedict, Boniface the Eighth. I think there are 2 or 3 more. So it's really sad that the papacy was occupied by real corrupt people, the scoundrel popes, so to speak. So many of them, and this is one of the questions for discussions. What happened to the church? Did the church die? Was the teachings of the corrupt of the church perverted by these popes? Well, that's what we are going to discuss when we break out into groups. Okay, so as I was mentioning, despite all of these things that were happening, saintly people never gave up, and this came about the renewal of the church. There was a real surge of monasticism. If we go to the next slide, these are the people who never gave up on the church. They founded monastic orders. Monasticism is a group of very holy people, and most of the time they devoted themselves in intense prayer. So they put up at the same time the monastery of Cluny, Camaldolese, and the Carthusians. So all of this really sustained the existence of the church until finally a Roman emperor came into the fore. If we go to the next slide, you call that the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. He was a German king who became Roman emperor in about 962 AD. He was crowned by Pope John the 12th, one of the bad popes, but the Holy Roman Emperor took charge from then on, and he was a very holy king. Yeah, as a matter of fact, he's considered the savior of Christendom. So he started appointing this time really holy people, religious people, spiritual people to the clergy, the bishops, and of course, even the Pope. He was the one who appointed them. And that bring about the rise of a very holy Pope, Pope Gregory the Great. We go to the next slide. He is Pope Gregory the Great, a very great saint that he is now. And he was the one who asserted a spiritual renewal in the church. He freed the church from secular emperors. This time he took charge of the spiritual affairs of the church. He freed the church from the emperors and rulers and asserted spiritual authority over them. Okay. And this is the episode where Henry IV was excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII. They had a disagreement. This time, after Otto I, of course, we have Henry IV that took over in the empire, and at that particular time, there was a great disagreement whether Pope Gregory VII would still have the authority to appoint the people in the clergy, and King Henry IV was also appointing some clergy people from his relatives and so on, from his friends. So that disagreement really exploded until Pope Gregory VII really asserted his authority on his spiritual matters. He really asserted that it is only the Pope who should be able to appoint bishops of the church. And so when Emperor IV would not cede to the authority of Gregory VII, he was actually excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII. So Henry IV was excommunicated over this question of who had the right to appoint church officials, and of course Pope Gregory VII finally prevailed. But if you will go on this part of the history of the church, eventually Pope Henry IV took vengeance over Pope Gregory VII, and he had actually deposed Pope Gregory VII until he passed after that. So the next episode in the church now is the schism in the church. Okay, we go to the next slide. The great schism between the East and the West. Okay, so now just a little review here. The West was pretty much still Christianized. The East was pretty much under the Islamic rule, but there were big part too that are still Christians in the East, because that would include Constantinople. Okay. There was an East-West issues that crystallized in a quarrel between Photius. Photius is a lay person. He was appointed Patriarch of Constantinople. Remember, Constantinople was one of the first archdioceses created by the church. Constantinople, now Istanbul in Turkey. All right, Pope, the emperor. Actually, the bishop of Constantinople was Ignatius, and the emperor deposed Ignatius and replaced him with a lay person, and his name is Photius, a layman. So Pope Nicholas, who was the pope at that time, restored Ignatius, because that's not valid according to Pope Nicholas. But then the succeeding emperor again reinstated Photius, and Pope Nicholas this time excommunicated Photius from the church and again reinstated Ignatius. So back and forth until Ignatius died. All right. So when Ignatius died, Photius again was made the patriarch by the emperor reigning at that time. So that's how the state was. And Photius was really recognized by the Pope, all right? Because Saint Nicholas also died. Pope Nicholas also died. So then succeeding recognized him, as the legitimate successor of Patriarch Ignatius after the latter's death in 877. However, Photius had condemned. Now here, being a layman, he started asserting primacy over the Pope. He condemned the primacy of the Pope of Rome. And then there was this controversy about filioque. I will discuss that in a little while. The filioque, whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. Oh my gosh, this is really just, I don't think it's a very important issue because it doesn't really matter, because the teaching of the church is that the Holy Spirit, that there's only one God and three divine persons. Whether one proceeded from the other, to me personally, should not really matter. But they were very legalistic about this, and this became the source of controversy, you know. And so when Photius died, he was taken over by Maxentius. And for about 150 years, everything just was left hanging. But the Cerularius, the new patriarch, revived this question of filioque. Okay, and if you go to the next slide, this is what happened. On the next slide here, Patriarch Michael Cerularius retaliated in 1054 because the church would not concede the filioque doctrine promoted by the East, that the Holy Spirit proceeded only from the Father, not from the Son. Now, as you know, our kid says, we believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeded from the Father and the Son. My gosh, can you imagine? This kind of thing would be such a big deal at that time. So Patriarch Michael Cerularius retaliated in 1052 by closing the Latin churches. When the Latin churches included that in the creed, it was already in the creed way back in the Nicene Creed, but when the Christian Church did not concede or correct, did not allow that to be corrected in 1054, Pope Leo X sent some representatives led by Cardinal Humbert to Cerularius to try to settle this, but they have a language problem, so to speak. They could not understand each other very well. And finally, Cardinal Humbert laid upon the altar of Hagia Sophia a bull of excommunication of Cerularius. So the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, was excommunicated by the Pope. Cerularius, on the other one, in retaliation, summoned his 20 metropolitans and anathemized the impious document, the document excommunicating him. Okay, so this seemed to be a more personal quarrel than excommunication, and friendly relations still continued between the churches, but there was a mutual excommunication. So this is what the schism is all about. If we go to the next slide, the church in the West is now known as the Roman Catholic Church, and the church in the East is now known as the Greek Orthodox Church. And consequently, Russia followed after the Greek Orthodox Church. So we have the Russian Orthodox Church. Now I know you have you may have this in mind as a question in your mind, that was this the only schism that really happened in the church? No, not really. But this is the first major schism in the church. There are several heresies that were being promoted in the past that practically were in schism from the papacy, but they were pretty much small groups. But this time, this is a large group. This consists of the entire church in the East. That's why this is what brought about what we call the Greek Orthodox Church. So we have the Greek Orthodox Church on the East and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. Okay? So we can discuss this more fully in our breakout room probably, or in the main room. Okay, now we go to the next episode in the church, which is, I know most of us are familiar with the Crusades. Okay, what's the Crusades? The Crusades is actually a military expedition organized by the church for the liberation of the Holy Land. As you know, uh, Islam has taken over most part of the East, and they have conquered even Jerusalem. Okay, so by 711, the Muslim armies took Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Jerusalem. You call that the Levant. They have control of practically about 2/3 of Christendom in the East. So Christians were being persecuted. By 1071, 300 years after the Christians, because of this persistent persecution of Christians in the East, they cried out for help from the church. And Pope Urban II in 1095 responded. There were like some crusades. Actually, the number of crusades from 1045 to 1400, 1095 to 1400, there were about 9 crusades. But these are the major crusades. We're taking up only the first, second, and third crusades, major crusades. So in 1095, Pope Urban II responded, calling the Knights of Christendom to assist, and launched the Crusades in order to stop the persecution of the Christians in the East and to capture back Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims. So let's go to the first crusade. On the next slide here, you will see the first crusade happened between 1096 to 1099. There's about 30 years. It started as a widespread pilgrimage. There were so many, because, Jerusalem is the birth of Christendom, actually. So there were many Europeans who wanted to go to and visit Jerusalem, but they were being persecuted and they couldn't do it. So they made some secret pilgrimages, but it ended as a military expedition by Roman Catholic Europe to regain the Holy Lands taken in Muslim conquest of the Levant. The Levant, as I said, is practically 2/3 of Christendom, which is Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Jerusalem. Now, during this crusade, knights, peasants, and serfs from many nations of Western Europe traveled over land and sea, first to Constantinople and then towards Jerusalem in the east. The Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem, launched an assault against the city. So who are the Crusaders? The Crusaders are mostly the knights the Knights of Christendom called by Pope Urban II, but they were joined by other military people from the East, from several European countries. All right. So the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, launched an assault upon the city, and captured the city. It was a successful crusade, but they were joined by some military people who are not spiritual at all, who were just plain warriors. And these warriors, as the practice before, whenever they invade a land, they would massacre the inhabitants. So this was the scandal of the first crusades. Many of these warriors from Europe massacred many of the city's Muslim, Christians, and Jewish inhabitants. So while the church was able to recapture Jerusalem, the church was being the world was scandalized by the actions of the Crusaders. But not all of these Crusaders were the knights called upon by Pope Urban II to launch this particular crusade. They were joined by just plain, even mercenaries or warriors from the different parts of Europe. Okay, so that's the first crusade. Then the second crusade. Let's go to the second crusade. Now, this is a major crusade launched from Europe because when the Muslims took over the Levant, okay, the very first ones that they conquered was the county of Edessa. So in response to the fall of Edessa the previous year, the Second Crusade was launched to recover the county of Edessa, right? And eventually, the Muslims really were able to reconquer the ones that fell into the Christian hands during the First Crusade. And they were led by Saladin. You must have heard about Saladin, the great, not so great to me, of course, the notorious Muslim warrior in the Second Crusade, who ultimately caused the fall of Jerusalem once again in the hands of the Muslims. That is the Second Crusade, the fall of Edessa. And that crusade was announced by Pope Eugene III. This crusade was failure for the Crusaders and a great victory for the Muslims, who went on to recapture Jerusalem, led by the fearsome, notorious warrior Saladin. And so the third crusade was launched again to recapture Jerusalem. So this is because Jerusalem is precious to the Christian church. That's where Jesus Christ was born. That's where Christianity came about. That's where all it started. So it's very precious to them. The Third Crusade was happened between 1189 to 1192. Okay, but they failed. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The Crusader states in the Levant are restored to viability. You know, they entered into a Treaty of Jaffa. What is this Treaty of Jaffa? In the Treaty of Jaffa, while the Christians were not able to recover Jerusalem, provided they are not armed, they were allowed to have their pilgrimages in Jerusalem. That's the only thing that was attained in the crusade. So the Third Crusade, also known as the King Crusade, was an attempt by European leaders to reconquer the Holy Land from Saladin. The campaign was successful, capturing Acre, Jaffa, and reversing most of Saladin's conquest, but not Jerusalem. So the Levant, were many parts of the Levant was recovered by the Christians, but not Jerusalem, which is the emotional and spiritual motivation of that crusade. So you see what the church went through a lot, and this contributed later on, as we will know, to the more division in the church. So there was a great division in the church between the East and the West. This is the first major schism in the church. Okay, I think we have gone to the end. And so we are going